Okay. Testing, testing. Okay, great. Welcome. Good morning. A special welcome to our humanist kids this morning. Delighted to see you here. They're going to be with us until after the opening comments. So put your phones on mute and take a seat, and we'll get underway. Each week we start the program with a reading that highlights our humanist principles, famous humanists, or the history of humanism. This morning's reading is from the Bristol Humanist Group, and they wrote, "Humanism is an approach to life based on reason and our common humanity, recognizing that moral values are properly founded on human nature and experience alone." Now we'll give the kids a moment to head off to their class. Our programs address a wide variety of topics selected to enrich and inform our lives, including philosophy, arts, and sciences. Today's program is Malört, a redemption of a revered and reviled spirit. Our speaker today, Josh Noel, is one of the nation's most recognizable food and beverage journalists and had decades-long tenure at the Chicago Tribune, in addition to contributions to This American Life, the New York Times, and other publications. He has now turned to book form for his writing, first with his debut titled Barrel-Aged Stout and Selling Out, followed by the forthcoming Malört, A Love Story. And Josh mentioned just a moment ago that the Wall Street Journal reviewed it just yesterday? A couple days ago. Favorable reviews. So please welcome Josh Noel.
Hello. Thanks, Buzz. Thanks, everybody. I would like to point out that that Wall Street Journal review was not only favorable, but extremely favorable. So, you know, I'm just speaking the truth. When the cards turn up in your favor, you just got to sort of roll with it, right? So I'm actually going to read you a little bit of that review in a few minutes. So thanks for having me. Glad to be here. I have some familiarity with the organization. A good friend of mine grew up in this community in St. Louis. And that's how I first learned about it. And it's just nice to be in a space, how shall I put it, with some positive vibes in 2025, because those are kind of hard to come by these days. So I appreciate the energy and the invite to be here. So yes, my name's Josh Noel. I wrote for the Chicago Tribune for a long time. I wrote about a lot of things over my career there, including beer, and breweries, and spirits, and bars, and restaurants, and food, which is a pretty interesting thing to write about in Chicago. And in 2018, that led to the release of my first book, Barrel-Aged Stout and Selling Out, Goose Island, Anheuser-Busch, and How Craft Beer Became Big Business. It sort of starts as a scrappy underdog story, which was the story of craft beer. Everyone's familiar with the term craft beer and what that is, pretty much? Good. Yeah, it's pretty mainstream at this point, but it wasn't. You know, it really started as a reaction to the big beer companies and the fact that all you could get was Bud Light and Miller Lite and things like that. And so these craft brewers started doing sort of bold and innovative things in response to that. But then the largest beer company in the world, Anheuser-Busch, saw that as a little bit of a threat and decided it needed to get involved, so it bought Chicago's Goose Island Brewing, which was really the first major incursion, let's say, of a big brewery into craft brewing. So that was really a seminal moment for the industry. So that first book was about that. I knew I wanted to do a second book. I was sort of casting about and started a couple things, and nothing quite felt right. And then one night, it was actually Christmas night 2022, I think. That's my fact checker over there. I was in my kitchen, and this is Jeppson's Malört, as perhaps you are familiar. And we'll get into the details here, but this is something I enjoy. I keep in my home, and I have for a while, and especially I enjoy a shot after a large meal. So I had a large meal, took a shot to settle the stomach after the kids were in bed, and had this light bulb moment of, I wonder if I could write a book about this. What is this? This is a spirit. It's a liqueur, and it's a very simple product. It is basically neutral spirit, vodka, basically, that is aged on wormwood, which is a bitter, wild-growing herb, and then it gets some sugar to balance out the bitterness, because wormwood is intensely bitter. And so that's what this is. It's very simple. 3 ingredients, basically. It is a bitter spirit that is really good after a meal to settle the stomach. Excuse me. And in that light bulb moment, I thought, well, we don't know that much about Malört, and what we do know almost raises more questions. So Malört existed as really an afterthought in Chicago for a long time. It was this weird, intensely bitter spirit that very few people liked, very few people drank, and when people did drink it, they just sort of talked about how terrible it was and the fact that they never needed to drink it again, but also, oh my God, this is so bad, you need to try it. It has this strange power about it. It's like smelling the bad milk. Quite literally, it's, oh my God, this is terrible, you have to try this. There are not many products that have that power. Usually if we think of things as good or bad, and if something is good, we want to do it again. We want to try it again. If it's bad, nah. Malört is so bad, air quotes around bad, it becomes an experience and people want to share the experience. It just has this unique power that very few things that we eat and drink have. So Malört existed as an afterthought for years and years and years, but in about 2008, 2009, it really found, I'd call it a second life, but it was really a first life, even though it had been around since the 1920s. 2008, 2009, Chicago started to really champion this stuff. And it found, again, that first life, that first real life after being around for 80 years. And it got really popular in the bars of Chicago and became this sort of cult superstar. And people started getting Malört tattoos and wearing Malört t-shirts, such as this gentleman in the front row. So in that light bulb moment, I thought, I knew from writing about Malört at the Tribune that people were interested in it. That was sort of self-evident. It's this sort of cult product that people can't get enough of. They love to talk about it. Again, they love to hate it, but then love to hate it and to share it. Again, it's a product that's also an experience. So in that light bulb moment, I thought, well, we know, what do we know? We knew that Malört was this old product that had been around Chicago for decades and decades. We knew that this businessman had owned it for years and years. When he died in 1999, he left the brand to his secretary. She operated Malört for a while, and then it got incredibly popular, sort of out of nowhere, and people, like I talked about, hate it, and they love to hate it, and it just has this unique power. And in that moment, I thought, well, there were really two things that made me think there could be a book there, and I wasn't sure. It took me a few months of reporting to find out. Thing number one was, well, how did it get popular again? Why did this thing that had been sort of hiding in plain sight for literally decades suddenly find this massive audience in about 2008, 2009? That taps into this idea of something changed, right? There's some kind of change, and figuring out what that change was, I thought, could be the basis of an interesting book. A good book needs good characters. It needs interesting relationships. It needs conflict. It needs some resolution to that conflict. And one part of that little very narrow overview I just gave you made me think there could be some interesting characters and relationships here, he left it to his secretary. And sure enough, it turned out that the answer to both those things was quite interesting. And as a result, I got a book out of it. It did take about 3 months of reporting to be sure, but it was there. I'm going to put my prop down. I think we'll be tasting later, right? Yeah. So my first call, of course, was to the woman who had been the secretary. Her name's Pat Gablick. She was, I believe, 78 years old the first time we talked. I called her. The call went to her, not her voicemail, to her answering machine. And I started talking into the answering machine, and halfway through, she picks up the phone, and because I say, I'm Josh, I'm with I write for the Chicago Tribune. I think there might be something interesting to write about the story of Malört. She picks up the phone, she starts talking, we talk for an hour. And she gives me sort of the rundown that she'd been giving over the years. Really that first call is just about sort of establishing a little bit of rapport and sort of hearing it from her, the overview. And then at the end of that, I said, well, Pat, it's really good to talk to you. I might want to talk with you again if you don't mind. Because a book is it's a long play. It takes a lot of time, a lot of conversations. She said, "Oh, I don't know what else I could possibly tell you, but you're welcome to call me back." And so we wound up talking maybe another 50 times after that. And every time she would say, "I don't know what else you could possibly ask me." But Pat's a wonderful woman, and she was very game for sort of going down memory lane. And explaining to me what she could and what she couldn't. She would point me in the right directions to figure it out. And we talked about Malört and this product and how it became popular, though her knowledge of that was actually limited, believe it or not, even though she owned it for 20 years. But she did also open up to me about her own story. And her own relationship with the man who owned it for all those years, George Brody. He was a lawyer. That was his day job. His hobby, his life's work, was owning Jeppson's Malört. The very brief backstory is George went to Northwestern. He grew up with nothing on the west side of Chicago. Immigrant parents. They lived in a poor community of immigrants. I found the old records of who lived on their block and what they paid for rent. And this was a poor block of immigrants, and they were the poorest family on the block. At least their rent was the cheapest. So George grew up with nothing, but it was that time where if you really set your mind to it, I mean, it was truly a country where you could sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps then, and it was easier to do, and the infrastructure was there, such as Crane Junior College. He had nothing, but he went to Crane Junior College for free or close to free. Worked hard, and then he got into Northwestern. Wound up getting a law degree from Northwestern. Met his future wife at Northwestern, and he graduated just as Prohibition ended. And his wife's family, her name was Fritzie Beelzoff. The Beelzoff family owned a distillery, and they managed to stay open through Prohibition by making mixers and things like that, non-alcoholic products. So George graduates law school just as Prohibition is ending, and he is of the mind that why would he become a lawyer when Prohibition is ending and his wife's family owns a liquor company? Because the nation is probably about to have a mighty, mighty thirst, and he was right. And so George was a very smart guy. He was not the cuddliest guy from what I can gather. Not always the most generous guy, but he was a smart guy. He was an interesting guy. He was always sort of looking around the corner and read adeptly what he saw. And so he goes into his wife's family's liquor business. Ultimately, he buys it from her family, and he owns it. And he's got this whole portfolio of spirits. Ultimately leaves that business, but keeps one brand and one brand only from the portfolio. And it, of course, was Jeppson's Malört. And if he hadn't decided to keep it, we wouldn't be talking about it here today. It would almost certainly not exist. But he did keep it. And so that was one thing I asked Pat so many times. And I did talk to his name was George Brody, if I didn't say that. I talked to George's son, David, a few times too. So those are the two people I was able to talk to who really knew George intimately. And I asked them, why did George keep Malört, of all things? And they asked that too. Because no one, George didn't like Malört, Pat didn't like Malört, David, his son, didn't like Malört. No one liked Malört. But to George, it just presented the challenge of a lifetime. It became his hobby. He would say, I mean, as it was relayed to me, I could have kept a gin or a fruity liqueur or something, more conventional that people like. But where would the challenge have been in that? Malört was a challenge for him to sell it, to market it, to get people interested in this intensely bitter spirit. Was his hobby. It was his life's work. 65 years he owned it. And in the early on, he tried to sell Malört. He wrote his own. He was his own marketing agency. He was his own copywriter, and he initially tried to position Malört as this sort of high-end product you need to savor and sit with to truly understand, like oysters or green olives. And if you spend time with Malört, your taste buds will eventually come to understand its nuance and complexity. No one bought that. That went nowhere. So he pivoted and decided instead, he did a 180 and pivoted and instead began hanging around the neck of every bottle of Malört this tag that said, where is it? Are you man enough to drink our two-fisted liquor? He turned it into a macho dare. And he even had, some advertising. Are you man enough to drink Jepson? Because it's Jepson's Malört. This is some material he would send to retailers, the stores and the bars, trying to get them excited about selling Malört. No woman wets her whistle on Jepson. That's a he-man's prerogative. I mean, just stuff you would never hear in 2025, but I guess in the 60s you could get away with. But the point is he really leaned into, this is some difficult, polarizing stuff. So I'm going to talk about it that way and try to sell it that way. And guess what? That actually kind of worked. And he found his audience, blue-collar workers, back when we had all those steel mills on the southeast side, slaughterhouses. Though the factory workers, after their shift, they would go to the bars and they would drink Malört. And so he did find an audience for it in the late 60s, early 70s. And Malört sort of had its little mini heyday. From the early 70s on, sales went one direction and one direction only, which was down. The nation, its tastes changed. Those jobs literally went away. That generation sort of aged out. They died or they moved to Florida or, Arizona. And that audience just sort of disappeared. And with it fell Malört's fortunes. And George died in 1999, and he left the brand to the woman who was his secretary, who was, of course, not only his secretary. So he hired Pat Gabelick in 1966. She was 23. He was, I think, about 56 at the time. And after a year, she was no longer only his secretary. Yeah, life does interesting things, right? Different people have different relationships, and it's the way life goes. But they wound up staying together until his death in 1999. And George loved Malört. He would not let it go. There were a couple sort of obvious off-ramps for him to stop making it. For instance, the last distillery in Chicago closed in the mid-'80s. And that's where he was having Malört made. And he was 75. He had plenty of money. He could have just said, and sales were tanking. He could have easily just said, I had a good run with this stuff, I'm going to just let it go. He would not. He would not let it go. He hunted literally across the nation looking for a place to make Malört, and he found one in Florida. So he started having it made in Florida to sell it only in Chicago. And so from the mid-'80s until he died in 1999, that was how Malört operated. So George died in 99, left it to Pat, and George loved Malört, and Pat loved George. One way she could honor him in his memory was to keep making Malört. And it was just operating on autopilot. It was getting made in Florida. It was on the schedule. It was made 2 times a year. They would ship it up here to a warehouse, and I think it was Elmhurst. Pat's distributor would come pick it up, bring it to the handful of bars and stores that sold it, and it just sort of just on autopilot. It wasn't selling much. She was making very little money on it. But it just sort of kept going and kept going. And there was no reason for her to stop because it just was sort of working. And again, it was her way to honor George and honor George's memory and honor, again, his life's work. What strange life's work, but finally in about 2008, things started to change. So sales in 2000, let's say about 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, sales are bad. They're about 1,200 cases a year. In 2008, 2009, sales are still bad, still about 1,200 cases a year. And Pat was operating the company as a one-person company. Literally, she had no staff, just her. No salespeople, no marketing, no nothing, just her, operating out of her apartment, which was George's apartment. He left that to her as well. He left her the apartment on Lakeshore Drive, and he left her Malört. She operated it out of her spare bedroom. She just saw the sales figures. They were not good. What Pat didn't understand, because she had no sales staff, she had no one out there on the streets trying to sell the product, talking to bartenders, understanding what was happening with the brand, which, by the way, is basic stuff that any beer company, any liquor company would do. But Pat was operating on a shoestring, so she didn't have any of that. What Pat didn't realize was that the sales were bad in 2002 and they were bad in 2008, but even though she sold 1,200 cases both years, they were a very different 1,200 cases. In 2002 or so, that was 1,200 cases of a dying brand. By 2008, it was 1,200 cases of discovery. It was an entirely new audience, had turned over and discovered Malört and was excited about Malört. Again, early 2000s, 90s, 80s, it was the crusty old-timers, like those old factory workers who were just sort of hanging on. This one bar owner who sold Malört in the 80s told me that he kept it on hand because he had literally one guy who would come in the bar. His name was Carl, as I recall. It's in the book. And Carl would come in every day at 3 o'clock. He'd start ordering Malört shots. He had stomach problems, and he said Malört was the only thing that made him feel better. He'd start drinking his Malört at 3. At 3:30, Jeopardy better be on the TV for Carl. And Carl would sit there and watch Jeopardy and drink his Malört shots, and then he'd hang out for another hour or so. So Carl would come in 5 days a week, drink Malört for 2 hours. So this bartender in the 80s literally kept it for this one old-timer. And that was sort of how Malört hung on for a long time. But by 2008, something radical is happening. And Pat doesn't see it at all. Because again, she's just operating the company out of her spare bedroom. She has no idea what's happening out in the bars and in Chicago culture. But a new, younger generation was starting to discover it. And not only discover it, but be fascinated by it. Love it, even. And even when they didn't, it's not that they loved the taste, though some people did. Malört just had several things going for it in 2008 that resonated with sort of where culture was at that point. There were a few evolutions that all sort of lead back to why Malört was able to start thriving at that point. One is we sort of talked about before, which is craft beer. So this whole idea of craft, of local, authentic. These things started to become important in about 2008. There's not a firm line, but that's sort of really when it started to take off. The craft beer industry really took off, and with that came these really bold, interesting flavors. We were just sort of more adventurous in how we were eating and drinking. Farmers markets started to really proliferate. Local sourcing. Do you remember that back, 15 years ago? Like, restaurants started talking about where they source their ingredients. Well, this came from this farm 40 miles away. Like, we started thinking about that stuff, and 10 years before, we just were not thinking in that way. It was how we thought about what we ate and drank, but also literally what we ate and drank. 2008, you know what the unlikely parallel from Malört is? Kale. In the 1990s, no one in this room had a single piece of kale. I can guarantee you that. By 2008, people are eating kale. Are you familiar with the Hop Leaf, the great restaurant in Andersonville? Their owner is this guy, Michael Roper. He's one of my favorite people to talk to when I was covering how we ate and drank in Chicago for the Tribune. Michael was always one of my favorite people to talk to. Just because he's such an interesting thinker. He's so insightful. And I knew he didn't sell a lot of Malört at the Hop Leaf, but I still called him because I just wanted to I was trying to understand how Malört could have become as popular as it did and why it happened when it happened. And he gave me a great example. He opened the Hop Leaf in about, I think it was 94, thereabouts. We were talking in probably 2023 as I was reporting this book. And his most popular side dish at the time we were talking was Brussels sprouts. He said, if you had told me in the mid-90s that my most popular side dish in 2022 was going to be Brussels sprouts, I would have thought you were an absolute lunatic. Because we did not eat Brussels sprouts in the 90s. We just didn't. We didn't eat Brussels sprouts, we didn't eat kale. My point is, we're eating bigger flavors, bolder flavors, more adventurous flavors. We're drinking those flavors as well. I was and am a big craft beer guy. The first time I tasted a really bitter IPA, I will never forget that moment. It was 2000, I think probably 3 or 4 at Sheffield's, great bar, sort of near Wrigley Field. And I told the bartender, I'm interested in IPAs. I didn't really know much. I was just trying to learn. And he handed me this West Coast IPA from a brewery called Bear Republic in California. Racer 5 is the name of the beer. Blew me away. I didn't know a beer could be that bitter. But that was a seminal moment for me in how I thought about bitter flavor. So a lot of people were having that kind of experience, whether it was through craft beer and IPA, whether it was through kale or Brussels sprouts. We just started eating and drinking in a different way. And hiding in plain sight is Malört. So it's very bitter, but suddenly this new generation of eater and drinker is into that and intrigued by that and not repulsed by that. Even if everyone didn't love Malört, which plenty of people didn't, it was still an interesting flavor that people wanted to share and talk about and share that experience. And so in 2008, things really started to change. And people started to reach out to Pat saying, oh my God, I love this stuff, like younger guys about in their late 20s, early 30s. I love this stuff. I want to work for you for free. And she thought, who are these guys? And why are they reaching out to me? And don't they know no one cares about Malört? That was the first inkling she got that things were starting to change because these guys were knocking on her door saying, I want to come work for you. So the first guy was a guy named Peter Strom, the Chicago guy. He's lived here his whole life. And he starts working for Pat for free. He just emails her out of the blue and says, I'm fascinated by Malört. I love it. He had sort of correctly read between the lines that, it was operated by this one woman. She was in her 70s. She was operating it out of her apartment. Malört could disappear at any time, and he was worried that it would just vanish one day, and he was really taken by it, by the history of it, the authenticity of it, because, look at that. You can tell that there aren't a bunch of MBAs and marketers who put this together, right? This is This is pretty true to itself, and it certainly tastes like it's true to itself too. It's not trying to fool anyone. It just sort of is who it is. What it is. And Peter was really sort of taken by it. So he emails Pat, says, "I'd love to come work for you," and she says, "This is strange, but okay." And so Peter starts working for her for free, and he starts beating the streets and going into bars and sort of trying to spread the gospel. And then another young guy, also about 30, Sam Meckling, he reaches out, and he wants to get involved with the brand. He actually started, he was the very first person, is that an authentic original Malört t-shirt? Do you know? Okay, because that's actually what it looked like. It's pretty close to that. Sam was a Malört fanatic who, I mean, Pat was never going to make Malört shirts. She was as risk averse as they came when it came to operating this company. And Sam was this young bartender who was just struck by Malört and loved Malört. So he started making rogue Malört shirts. And Pat caught wind of that and was going to shut him down, got a lawyer, and she met with this guy, Sam, but she wound up so taken with him and charmed by his love of Malört, she wound up hiring him as well. So now she's got Sam and Peter working for her, and Malört's fortunes just rise and take off. I'm going to read you one little passage, if I may. So this is my bookmark as a Pokemon card, courtesy of my favorite guy in the first row there. So this is as Malört is starting to take off and Pat is starting to understand. She's still skeptical that Malört can have success because it's been such an afterthought for so long. But at this point, Peter and Sam are both involved, and they keep telling her, Malört's really starting to resonate out there in the world, and things are possible for this brand that you don't understand, and she didn't buy it. But this was actually the night where all that changed. Word was spreading. Jeppson's Malört was no longer just a Chicago story. In spring 2012, two media outlets with massive, albeit vastly different national audiences, The Onion and the Wall Street Journal, reached out. Pat could not believe the interest, the Journal especially. It was George's favorite newspaper, read daily front to back. Whatever skepticism she couldn't shake about Malört's rising fortunes finally blew away in a single moment on a warm Tuesday evening in late May 2012. It was Malört's first public event. Peter suggested the idea weeks earlier. Pat thought it sounded strange. An event for Malört? Why would anyone come to that? What Peter knew, and she still didn't, was the importance of connecting with an audience in the era of craft and local drinking. A generation earlier, alcoholic brands existed facelessly and ubiquitously, made in far-off factories and replicated as generic experiences coast to coast. Now it was about beer festivals, whiskey tastings, brewery tours, cocktail classes, beer pairing dinners. The new generation didn't simply want brands, it wanted experience. The result was called the first annual Malört Night, featuring $3 Malört shots and $5 Malört cocktails, face-twisting versions of margaritas, mojitos, and Manhattans made with Malört. On social media, the team touted the chance to meet Malört employees for the first time, which was actually a pretty radical and exciting thing because Malört's really starting to take off, and it had existed as such a faceless, mysterious company that the opportunity to stand in a bar and talk to the people behind Malört was actually a very exciting thing for people at that moment in time. One Facebook reply said it was, quote, great to know that this event will be spectacular and awful at the same time. The location, Nice Lounge, 2 blocks from Wrigley Field, was one of the city's best Malört accounts. Pat fretted like a nervous party host. What if no one comes? Sure enough, as the 6:30 p.m. start time loomed, turnout looked slight. Peter and Sam were there, of course. Her lawyer came. The Wall Street Journal reporter showed up to take notes and shoot video. Pat, dressed in black pants and a short-sleeved aqua turtleneck, sat at the bar drinking white wine, figuring she was right all along. No one really cared much about Jeppson's Malört. Peter's exuberance had gotten the best of him. She chatted with her lawyer, her back to the door, and when she turned around, she saw something remarkable. A room full of people. An extra alarm fire at a furniture store along the city's L tracks had halted trains for nearly 3 hours, which slowed everyone's arrival. But there they were, ready to revel in Malört. The room suddenly felt electric. As bartenders poured shots and shook cocktails beneath Christmas lights strung through the ceiling, Peter stood before the crowd and introduced himself as the Malört historian. He was dressed in a white-collared shirt tucked into jeans, nearly shaking with adrenaline, thrilled to be talking to a room of strangers about this thing he loved. He said he got involved with the company out of sheer curiosity, wanting to learn more about Malört and maybe chronicle its history because there wasn't much online. He talked of digging through Pat's files and the decades of history he discovered. He briefly explained what he'd stitched together. Jeppson's Malört was an old Swedish drink sold by a man named Carl Jeppson. Carl came to Chicago from Sweden's southern coast. Peter talked of George buying the company after Prohibition. Peter spoke for 10 minutes, then took questions. First up, what ingredients make Malört taste the way it does? I'm not going to give away our recipe, Peter said, but suffice to say the name Jeppson's Malört, from the crowd came a cry. Baby tears! Peter understood the shock aspect of Malört. It got people in the door, both literally and figuratively. It no doubt helped pack Nice Lounge and accounted for much of the enthusiasm in the room. He also wanted people to appreciate its history as he did. He knew it would be a process, so he rolled with it. Baby tears, yes, he said. He paused, then continued. The main ingredient in Malört, I'll just put it this way. The name of the drink is Jeppson's Malört, and Malört is Swedish for wormwood. I can't say anything more than that, but maybe if I'm drunk, I'll tell you later. Everyone laughed. After a few more questions, someone asked, is Malört sold in other cities other than Chicago? Peter repeated the question before delivering an emphatic answer. No, he boomed. Malört is sold only in Chicago. It was the loudest applause of the night. At the end of his presentation, Peter summoned Pat to join him. She nervously clasped her hands as he introduced her to a roar of cheers. She could not believe the response, doubly bewildered as starstruck youngsters asked to pose with her for selfies afterward. It was a magical and heartening evening with a single regret. As Pat told the Journal reporter, she wished George could have seen what became of his lifelong hobby. I hope he is watching us, she said. So that was really the night where everything changed for Malört, and Pat really understood what was happening. The story is by turns sad and sweet, and then after this it starts to get complicated because with success comes complication. And other distilleries started making products they wanted to call Malört too, and that led to a big legal battle over the word Malört. Because the sense from the Jeppson's crew, from Pat and her and Peter and Sam and Pat's lawyer, was if they lost the word Malört, what would be left of the brand? So that unfolded as a battle between Jeppson's and some smaller local distilleries, but then a really large international distillery also got involved, not wanting Pat to be able to trademark the word Malört. So that became a very expensive and complicated battle. And as I said, with success comes complications. And Peter had one vision for Malört. Sam had another. There were some hard feelings. There were some breakups. And it was painful because, believe it or not, people at this, especially at this point in time, Malört was such an underdog, and these people, Peter and Sam especially, loved Malört. And when someone would leave the company, this will sound crazy, but it was almost, and I talked to both these guys about this, they would talk about leaving, no longer working for the company, no longer having the brand in their lives, no longer sort of being the Malört guy. And the way they would talk about it, I said, it almost sounds like a romantic breakup, like a real profound loss in your life. And they both said, absolutely. That's the unique power of Malört. No one feels that way about a vodka, right? But that's Malört. It's got this scrappy charm. And lucky for me, it led to a really fascinating story to tell. I think of it as Malört is the axis around which everything spins, but I think that the book works because it is really a story of people and relationships. And Malört certainly is a fascinating character unto itself, but what Malört made people feel about it is really sort of the heart of the story. George loving Malört, Pat loving George, then this new generation. Peter loving Malört, Sam loving Malört, and Malört presenting Pat at a time where a lot of people are slowing down, late 60s, early 70s. This opened a whole new world to Pat, and she was spending hours in bars meeting Malört fans, and she loved it. She loved to socialize in the bars. She did as a younger person, and then she did when this opportunity came back to her later in life. I am going to read a little bit of the journal review, if I may, because I thought the guy who wrote it really, I appreciated what he said, and I thought he did a nice job capturing what I was intending to do. It says, I make the story of Malört into the story of a changing Chicago. George Brody feels like a character from Saul Bellows' The Adventures of Augie Marsh, full of brash entrepreneurial energy. Indeed, Bellow, we are told, was one of Brody's childhood neighbors, which is true. The decline of Malört's popularity during the second half of the 20th century tracks the decline of working-class Chicago. Its resurgence, the gentrification of Nelson Algren's and Stud Terkel's hard-scrabble neighborhoods into bougie playgrounds. But Mr. Noel, you flatter me, Wall Street Journal, also affectionately portrays the open-hearted, inventive spirit of the early social media era that propelled Malört to profitable notoriety. In the end, his account of the bitter beverage has a hard-won sweetness. This quirky, enlightening, unexpectedly poignant book isn't only for aficionados of the offbeat Chicago liquor, but fans of stubborn underdogs everywhere. So I really appreciate that review, because that's what I was going for. I mean, if it was just a story of one brand of alcohol, well, that's not going to be that interesting. You could summarize that in a couple paragraphs on a website. This is the reason the story worked, and I feel really lucky to have been able to tell it, is because of the characters, the people, the relationships, and the city of Chicago and how it changed and how cultural tastes change. And it all happens to merge into this one wonderfully horrific and delicious spirit. So thank you. I am curious, who here has not tasted Malört before? Oh, that's a lot of people. Of you people, who is going to taste it this morning for the first? Oh, there's an enthusiastic in the. Yeah, don't be shy. Don't be shy. And then I'm curious. So, of the people who have tasted it, who thinks it's just terrible and you never need to taste it again? That's fair. I don't judge. That's fair. That's fair. Who authentically just enjoys it and likes it? That's me. Okay. And then there's always that middle ground of people who sort of just appreciate its place in Chicago culture. That's usually gets the most hands, and that's fair too. So, okay, great. Do we have questions?
After an interlude.
Okay, interlude. You interlude, and I'll
have a seat.
I'll take a seat.
I'll interlude. Thank you, Josh. That was terrific. Before he takes your questions, we're going to have a short musical break. Please share your support for our programs with a donation as the basket is passed around. So thank you, Kara. $5 is suggested, but any amount you're able to give is appreciated. You can also make contributions at our website and via QR codes posted here in the auditorium. Pardon? Yes, it is. Okay, Josh will now take your questions. Please line up at the microphone and try to keep your questions short, no commentary, so we can get to as many questions as possible. Anyone viewing this program on YouTube can submit your questions in the chat box, and I'll read them out. Pardon me. I'll read them out for the speaker. Go ahead, Josh.
I was just trying to see how many viewers we had on YouTube. Looks like 7. Hello to the 7 of you. Yes, sir. Hi.
I'm Dave. I just wanted to say that it seems to me that most of us are looking for a sense of perspective in times that are very uncertain. And one of the ways of doing that is to understand ourselves in terms of a perspective. One of the things that happens in Chicago is a working class perspective generally, although as you point out, people, the clientele for the drink kind of passed away as the Rust Belt workers kind of dissipated. Yep. So it seems to me it's economically kind of related to a sense of identity with working class people, first of all, and then of course a change to a more yuppie-oriented identity. One small thing, if it seems to me that in a time of very uncertainty, would you say that one of the ways of making a small economic benefit for yourself is to give people a small pleasure? Usually they are not going to be able to get a lot of things that they want, but one of the things you can get is a good drink. And that's one of the things that tends to encourage people to do a small drink like this one or a bar. Would you say that that's a pretty good indication of a economic possibility for people in these uncertain times?
There's a lot there. Yes, and actually I'm going to invoke Michael Roper from the Hop Leaf again. So he has a lot of fancy, expensive beers on his tap list, but he always maintained one tap line that it used. I think it was a $3 tap line, and then it became $4, and I think now it's $5. You know, that is the world we live in. But he very stubbornly clung to having one affordable beer on draft, an affordable luxury. He wanted, really sort of the average person to be able to walk into his bar and, as he said, have 2 or 3 beers, but tip a few bucks and then have a few bucks left over for breakfast, for a couple eggs in the morning at the corner diner. He saw the role that alcohol, and it's not about the alcohol, right? I mean, it's really more about sort of the community and the communal spirit and what happens in bars. He saw that as really an important piece of what happens culturally, especially in a city like this. So yes, I agree completely with what you said there. And I think that was a lot of the power of Malört too. It is one moment that really sort of helped crystallize what the power of Malört is. It's not just that it's bad, it's that it's an experience. It is, and it's usually it's a cheaper shot. I just saw it on a menu for a $10 shot, which I find absolutely repulsive, far more repulsive than Malört itself. A shot of Malört should never cost more than $5. I hope every bartender, every bar owner in the country somehow sees this video. No more than $5. Come on, it's Malört, for God's sake. But Malört historically was, it was early on. It was so bad that a lot of times bartenders would give it away because they couldn't really sell it, and that was in the sort of those early go-go days of Malört. People would drink it for free and they'd share it, or it'd just be a couple bucks. But yeah, it was an affordable luxury, but really an experience. So that's sort of what's so cool, I think, about what I really like about beer and bars and cocktails and spirits is it's not just the drinking of alcohol. That actually doesn't do a ton for me personally. It's the experience and the community and the culture around which those things exist. And Malört is one of the greatest examples of how all those things merge.
Glad you're here.
Thank you.
Is Malört still made in Florida, or are they making it in Chicago? Is it popular in Sweden? And the Onion review.
So that's a big, so everything is answered in the book. But yeah, so the risk is usually that I'm going to stand up here and go on too long. So sometimes I try to censor myself. So sometimes I skip over those things. But so that's an important part of the narrative. So George Brody started to have Malört made in Florida in the mid-'80s, as I said, to have it sold only in Chicago. And I'm of the opinion that actually, once Malört started having its comeback, I think that almost worked to its advantage, because it was such a strange, mysterious product. People would taste it, and literally, this was Sam Meckling, the guy who was one of the most important characters in the book and helped propel Malört into what it became. Sam quite literally had this experience. He worked at this bar. One of the other he was a bouncer. One of the other bouncers told him about Malört and said it tastes like an alcohol, like if you took vodka, put it in your junk drawer, you know, the one in your kitchen with the rubber bands and the pennies and the twist ties, you swish the alcohol around and then you drank it. That's what Malört tastes like. And Sam, of course, thought, why would anyone want to taste that? But he had his first shot that night and he was immediately captivated. And so he did what so many people did, which is he looked at it and he thought, well, that's, you know, not, as we discussed, not the prettiest label, but it's like, that's kind of strange, and what is Malört? And then he would spin it around, because everyone always wants to know, what is this stuff? Why does it exist? So you look for clues. You look at the label on the back. And when you looked on the back, it said, made in Auburndale, Florida, which, it's like, what? This stuff tastes like this? It's available only in Chicago and it's made in Florida? Like, what is going on here? So I think that was actually an important part of how it just stimulated the imagination. But so Pat did, sales started to climb after 2008. Went from about 1,200 cases to about 3,000 cases to about 5,000 cases, 7,500 cases, and that is crazy growth for a spirit brand. Malört was on fire. And so by 2018, Pat was ready to retire. She was about 75 years old, and Malört had almost no value when she acquired it. By 2018, she knew she had something. It was growing like crazy, and it was all over. It was in the Onion and the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Tribune, and et cetera, et cetera. So in 2018, she sold it to a local distillery called CH Distilling, or is it CH Distillery? One of the two, I forget. They're based here, and they did bring production back to Chicago for the first time since the mid-'80s. So it is now made again in Chicago by CH. What else? Oh, Sweden. It is not sold in Sweden. But so what, I sort of skipped over what it, the guilty revealed himself. We're in Skokie, it's safe, no one's gonna take your car. So what Malört is not a Malört. Malört is a Besk, B-E-S-K. Which is, that's what this neutral spirit aged on wormwood is. And it is a very traditional drink in southern Sweden, which is where Carl Jeppsson, the Swedish immigrant who introduced it to Chicago, came from. So there is Besk all over Sweden, southern Sweden especially still, but Malört is, what we call Malört is not sold there. I have done a few events and readings with Swedish people in the crowd, like actual people from Sweden, and it's always interesting to see them taste it and hear their reaction. And they just sort of shrug and say, "Yeah, that's a Besk, all right." I don't think it's the most elegant or refined version of Besk, probably, but it is authentic to to the culture, as best I can gather. It is not sold there, but they already have their own, you know. And the third thing, I don't remember, the Onion article was just an article about Malört. I can't even, I read it at the time. Actually, I read it during the review, the reporting for the book. I can't remember what it said. But the real holy crap moment was that Wall Street Journal article, which ran in November of 2012. I actually tracked down the reporter to ask how he even came to write about it and why and how it almost didn't run, but it sort of squeaked through at the last minute, and it ran on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And that was also a real, like, wow, Pat just could not believe that Malört was on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. And that was a real turning point for the brand as well.
Okay, we have a question from one of our 7 online viewers. Are there any other similar liquors for people who kind of like it, but maybe something similar would be even more attractive? Also for us non-serious drinkers who are cheap and would like something less expensive, like I drink Modelo Negra beer as an alternative to imported German dark beers.
Yeah, Modelo Negra, I'm a longtime fan. Tip of the cap on that one. Well, if this person is in Chicago, what I would recommend is one of the brands that sprung up in response to the success of Malört was from a small distillery in Chicago called Leatherby, and they released something they called Malört, which was the moment where Pat and Sam and Peter thought, wow, we might have a problem on our hands here, because if they're also making Malört, then, you know, are we going to lose the power of our brand? That went through there were some stern letters from lawyers sent back and forth, and in the end they changed the name to Besk. So now it's called Leatherby Besk. But it is basically their take on Malört. It has a bunch of ingredients that Malört doesn't. They're actually listed in the book. I wrote about how that came to be. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but it's a really lovely and delicate take on a Besk, whereas Malört is sort of all sharp elbows and rough edges mostly. Leatherby Besk is really, it is truly sort of a craft interpretation of what Malört is. So that if you're looking for a more gentle and, dare I say, enjoyable entry into the realm of Besk, I would probably recommend the Leatherby. But as far as affordable, I mean, this is, we're talking sort of, when you're talking spirits, you sort of get what you pay for. So, actually, one way to sort of have a cheaper experience with Malört is CH sells it in those little airplane bottles. Those are going to be a lot cheaper. So a bottle of Malört costs probably $22 to $25, something like that. But you can buy a 6-pack, I think it's a 6-pack of the airplane bottles, and that, I don't know what that costs, but that's going to probably be more like 10 or something like that. So that's a cheaper way. And then if you hate it, you can just give the other 5 bottles away. Perfect.
What's interesting, is this working?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay, it's interesting that you talked about those little airplane bottles, because just a few days ago, a few friends, they took my survey, who's heard of this? And this one guy from Denmark, but he said, well, my son has. Yeah. And I was going to say, just a few years ago, they had an ad, to try to get people to know it. You take the labels off those little small bottles, and then you get free ones. And I thought when Malört, I didn't realize from now until you say there's all these different companies, kind of several. So that was a sales technique. And you're saying that's the cheapest one?
The airplane bottles?
Yeah.
I would assume. I mean, actually per ounce, it might wind up being, it's probably more expensive per ounce, but it's going to be cheaper on the front end if you're just trying to dabble. Or you could just go into a bar and get a shot and try it. My one piece of advice is just take the shot. Don't sip it. Just take it down. It's the way Malört is meant to be had.
You are going to have us taste it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else? Oh, there we go.
Thank you very much. I would like to unfriend someone in person, so
Yep.
I'll share a Malört with someone later. I've understood in my research about Malört, yours is, I'm sure, in much greater depth, that there was a change in recipe at some point to make it more palatable, and then there was a revolt amongst the consumers, the regular consumers. Did you come across that? Like, is that something that actually happened, or was that just myth?
Well, a couple things. One is that Malört's character has always traditionally changed batch to batch because it's such a simple product. The thing that's doing the heavy lifting is the wormwood. So if you get really fresh wormwood, you're going to get a really nice, bitter product in the end. Sometimes, so again, Pat, as we've established, was not the most sophisticated business owner, which she will be the first one to tell you that. She was great. Whenever someone would say, "You're such an inspiration, what you did with Malört is so amazing," she'd always say, "I didn't do anything. It's just the hipsters found it and the bartenders liked it and it just became popular. I didn't do a thing." She would say that endlessly. She took no credit. But as part of that so she didn't have a lot of controls over the quality of the wormwood. So when she would get more dried out wormwood, you'd get a very different Malört. It would be usually less bitter and sometimes more vegetal, which that's actually, to me, gross Malört is the one that's more vegetal. Like, give me the bitter, but when it starts going into vegetal, so Malört has always sort of changed over the years. When CH began making it here, the first batch did have a change in recipe, but that was actually an oops. They were playing with it in small amounts, trying to figure out how to make it. They got it, but then they scaled up the sugar wrong. So the first batch came out and it was too sweet. And one guy described it to me as tasting like a can of Coke if you let the can of Coke sit out warm all night or something like that. It was just off. And CH knew they screwed up. So in following batches, they did correct that. So they weren't trying to change it. That said, they have changed it. It is now easier to drink and it is more palatable than it used to be. The owner of CH talked about wanting to build out the front end of the sip a little bit. So that basically means it has more sugar. So when you first taste it, it's got more roundness, more sweetness, more approachability to it. And then it still has that long, bitter finish. Yep. It still, to me, tastes like grapefruit pith and rubber bands in the finish. But at the front end, it is sweeter and gentler and easier to drink. Whereas before, it used to be it would be really thin on the front end and then go into that long bitterness. So it was really worse before. And I think it's interesting, like the hardcore Malört fans always ask at things like this. You always self-identify because that's the number one question. And I think it's like, if you truly enjoy Malört, I think it's the most relevant question. How has Malört changed? Because it sure seems like it's changed. And it has changed. And, on one hand, I do think something is lost by it becoming a little more nuanced and a little more complex. But I will say that finish is still pretty bitter. And so I think it's still true to what it was. And the owner of CH, a guy named Tremaine, he said if it was really just only as bad as it could be, that would sort of, there's authenticity in that, and it's more of a punchline, but people aren't going to drink it again. He wanted to make it a little rounder, a little more balanced, just to give it a little more staying power, while not betraying that bitter character. So I think he's actually threaded that needle pretty well. But that said, is something lost from 2008 when people were tasting it and were just shocked by what they tasted? Yeah, something is lost, but it's also, things change, so it's okay.
All kinds of questions came up as a result of your last answer, but my question is, when you said it has wormwood in it, that made me think of absinthe, which wormwood is also the big ingredient there.
Yep.
And that was banned in the United States and a bunch of other countries from like 1915 on until the early 2000s, if I recall, because it was said to cause hallucinogenic properties
Yep.
and, madness and whatnot. So was there ever any effort on the part of the U.S. government to close down Malört because it had the same active ingredient as absinthe, which was illegal?
I'm going to give you the total cop-out answer. Read the book. Yeah, I do. Yeah. But that's a really astute question, and the answer is yes. And it caused some drama, especially for Pat. But yes, that was an issue. But it was also, it didn't need to be an issue, I'll put it that way. But yeah, there was not very good understanding of wormwood, and there's a property within called thujone. That's the what supposedly leads to hallucinations and all. I mean, that's all nonsense. But it did create some issues for her, and that was this was after George died, and she did run into a situation where she thought she was going to lose the company as a result of it.
That's serious. All right, can I ask my second little
course.
question? What did they do with all those overly sugary bottles of Malört?
The early stuff?
No, the CH people who screwed up the first batches.
Oh,
Did they have
well,
them
this
covered?
was back in 28. What was it? Would have been 2019. It went out into the market.
Oh.
Yeah, and they, and Tremaine said maybe I shouldn't have done that, but that would have been a pretty big financial loss. But they just sort of bit the bullet and put it out, and then slowly kept tweaking the recipe until they really sort of got it to where they wanted it to be.
Another online question. In the culture zeitgeist that was happening around 2008, were there any other cities identifying a liqueur that became uniquely theirs like Malört did for Chicago?
That's a good question. There is something I can't remember, Pittsburgh or Cleveland or somewhere like that. Nothing quite like this is really the ultimate answer. Different places do have their sort of local thing, like old style beer was our local thing. And I went to Bonnaroo, the concert, years ago, and we brought some old style, and some guys from the next campsite over saw that, and they're like, "Is that a real beer? What is that?" So it's like, that's just, brands are hyper local, and Malört it was at that time the most hyper local of spirit brands. But yeah, other places have their little things, but nothing on this scale.
Hi, I go to Birdie Man out in Nevada and some other things near Austin and Michigan, and we try to bring some to Chicago. So sometimes we set up a bar, and we offer a full Chicago handshake.
Yep.
Which is a shot of Malört.
And an old style.
Down an old style, and then an optional slap in the face.
Does anyone take you up on that?
And, I'm sorry?
Does anyone take you up on the slap in the face?
Oh my God, it's part of the whole experience, yes.
Really?
So
I would think the Malört would be enough, but...
But it's of the same menu. You hate it, but you love it. So, the slap in the face is optional, and we say, how do you want it on a scale of 1 to 10?
Wow.
And depending on who the bartender is, the bartender says, and I'll partake with you if you want, and we'll. And it's so common for someone to come and ask for slap in the 5 on a scale of 10, and they get it, and then they come back 2 hours later with 10 of their friends, and like, we all have to do this together. Let's go. And it's such an odd bonding experience, and such an odd way to bring, the best of Chicago, if you will, around the country. But I'm wondering I don't know who came up with that, and I don't know if you've heard of that or
The Chicago handshake?
What we call the full Chicago handshake.
I will be honest, I've never heard of the slap in the face part.
Okay, maybe we made it up. I'm not quite sure.
I think you may have. that may be Burning Man, the whatever you're taking to Burning Man kicking in.
And we do find that some people really enjoy the taste of it when it's warmed up quite a bit. Have you noticed that? Or?
God, warm Malört sounds terrible, but hot Malört. I've actually never done that. I probably should try it.
Almost like hot tea or something. Right?
Yeah, no, actually, I think Malört and tea are actually sort of cousins in a way. I mean, I could see it. Yeah, warm, bitter drink. Yeah, I'd probably want to mix it in something, maybe in some tea. But yeah, no, the Chicago Handshake. So the Chicago Handshake, that's the guy I mentioned, Sam Meckling. That's his brainchild, along with some other people. But he basically, once he got involved, his concern was that people were only gonna, if Malört was just sort of gross and terrible, and you have to try this one time, that became the ceiling of Malört, that people wouldn't ever come back for a second time. So he wanted to create an occasion where people would have Malört again. And he, along with the old style folks, came up with the idea of the Chicago Handshake. Brilliantly named, really brilliant piece of marketing, because here we are still talking about it all these years later, and it's every Chicago bartender knows what a Chicago Handshake is. And now you'll see it, you know, us Chicago people like to spread our wings and go all over the place. There's a bar in Denver where you can get a Chicago Handshake. And it's really all over the place at this point. But so it's a Chicago Handshake is a shot of Malört with an old style beer. And my thing is, don't drink the beer too quick. You gotta have the Malört, let it do its thing for 2-3 minutes at least, then have the beer. Don't chase the bitterness away. Don't hide. Revel in it. Let it linger.
I was trying to rack my brain for the cousins, and I feel like in Chicago, Underberg and the bartender's handshake and Coke are the closest that I can think of. But going back to 2008, that's when I turned 21, was 2008. And curious about the economics, if that came up at all, and my generation kind of went through this, and 8 years of the Bush administration ending with a giant financial collapse where none of us could get jobs. And I felt like that, Malört, if they starting to pick up that time, I loved your analysis of bitter foods and new things that people were trying out, but it was also, I project onto it the need for that economic, like really cheap, you can buy it,
Yeah.
you won't want to have a second one, so your pocketbooks will remain full.
Yeah.
Did that come up in your analysis?
Well, did you hear the first question this gentleman asked? Yeah, it's sort of a cousin to that question, the affordable luxury. And again, in those early days, bartenders would give it away because who's going to pay for this stuff? And now, of course, now they will. But back then, it was very much the scrappy underdog working class shot, and it was intensely Chicago.
One more online question.
Sure.
Are there vintages that people collect? Can you tell the different batches?
Yes. Yes and yes. I mean, I don't think there are that many collectors. I was able to taste a lot of different vintages while reporting the book. Eventually, Pat and I would meet up at her apartment, and she would let me go through her years of archives and the boxes in her storage unit in the basement. And I found a lot of really fascinating history that way. But she also had a ton of old Malört. Because she would, every time Florida made a batch, they would send her a bottle. There was one batch in about 2003 that was I'm trying to remember what was wrong with it. I think it was too sweet. So it's happened over the years. And she got some of the old, there were not a lot of people drinking it in 2003, but there were some of those crusty old timers. And one of them did reach out to her and said, this doesn't taste right. So she started asking Florida to send her a bottle of every batch so she could taste it to make sure it was okay. So she hated Malört. So she would open it, take the smallest taste, spit it out, close the bottle up, stick it in the closet. So she had just years of Malört bottles in her closet. And she said, what am I going to do with it? Take it. So I took it. And it was really interesting to taste all those years. So yes, vintages is absolutely a thing. There's less variation now because CH is really, it's a proper distillery. And a food and beverage company generally wants the consumer to have confidence that what they're going to be tasting. So that's, a Miller Lite tastes the same in Florida as in Chicago, as in Seattle, as in Arizona, because that's what Miller Lite needs to be. And so Malört is now sort of, because it is owned by a proper liquor company, CH wants Malört to be consistent and for people to know what they're getting when they open the bottle. Back in those early days, though, when Pat had very few controls over the product or oversight or knowledge, really, of even what kind of wormwood she was getting, there was a lot of variation batch to batch. And the people who were sort of along for the ride at that time would sort of revel in, they'd go to the bar and get their shot, and it would taste the same for a few months, and then they'd get a shot, and it's a new batch. Oh, this one's more bitter, or this one's less bitter, or oh, this one's more vegetal, or whatever it was. So I'm sure there are some collectors out there. It's not a big thing, and it's hard to find those old bottles. But yeah, a lot of variation, and sort of understanding Malört vintages and tasting them side by side is an interesting thing, and I was fortunate enough, with big air quotes around fortunate enough, to be able to do that during the reporting of the book. Yeah.
Thanks for writing the book and for coming and speaking today. I'm curious about this, describing it as cheap or inexpensive, and then you're describing it as being aged, because generally spirits are cheap if you just distill and bottle. So how long is this being aged? And why would it be cheaper than any other liquor? Is this just something we're saying because of the taste, or is it actually cheaper to make? Or
Well, you're thinking of aging in terms of like an age statement on a whiskey, so like a 12-year-old whiskey. Like this is not 12-year-old Malört. The spirit is aged on the wormwood for about 3 weeks. That's the aging. It just needs to impart, the wormwood needs to impart its flavor into the liquid. That's the whole, it's like steeping tea, really. That's why whoever mentioned tea before, I see them as sort of, there's like a similar thing happening. So it's not about aging Malört for the age statement. You're not trying to get some expression of age. You're just trying to get expression of wormwood.
and it's not cheaper than other liquors, is it?
It used to be, but now that people actually like drinking it, it's a lot more. It's probably more than double the price it was back in 08, 09.
Looks like that's it.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. When I bought the bottle yesterday at Binny's, it was the only bottle in the store on the bottom shelf, and I got a lot of comments from the staff as I was carrying it out. $25, by the way.
25, yeah.
All right. So I will now read the announcements. And let's see if they're here. The announcements, here, right in front of me. Jeez. Okay. Our next virtual community chat will be on Wednesday, March 26th at 7 p.m. We share friendship, issues of the day, and fun in a caring Zoom chat. Join us to connect and enjoy each other's company. You can find the link in today's bulletin or on the activities page of our website. For our next community service outing, we'll be volunteering at the Vineyard Food Pantry in Evanston. Tasks include helping guests choose their items, managing the line, packing grocery bags, helping guests to their cars, etc. This is open to adults and teens over the age of 12. Please sign up at the link in today's bulletin to join us in this meaningful community service activity. Contact Carrie Ost with any questions. All EH members are encouraged to attend one of this spring's members' dinners. I believe some have already taken place. There are a couple more dinners scheduled in the next few weeks in a member's home. For more information on dates and locations and how to sign up, see Ben Ost, who is here today. For our Community Day program, next Sunday, March 23rd, we'll have a creativity fair. The fair will showcase the creative endeavors of members of our community as a display, a performance, or an interactive experience. Several of our creators will have an opportunity for you to try your hand at a similar project. We look forward to seeing you at the fair. For more details on upcoming Sunday morning programs and other activities, see our website at ethicalhumanistsociety.org. Connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for videos of past speakers and future streaming programs. Visitors are invited to sign up at the welcome desk to receive our newsletter. If you have any questions about the society, please look for a member with a welcome name tag or help yourself to literature that's available in the reception hall. And last, if the descriptions of Malört haven't scared you off yet, yes, there is a bottle for tasting. If you haven't tried it yet, or if you've tried it but you haven't learned your lesson. Thank you all for coming out today, and please join us for the social hour.
Talk about the thing above your head.
The thing above my head? Oh, well, that wasn't on the announcements. That, oh, here it is. I beg your pardon. Thank you, Glenda. Okay. On Sunday, March 30th, Fish Stark, the executive director for the American Humanist Association, will present Humanists Move America, how and why humanists are heroes in the American story. Now more than ever, people need to feel like heroes. And Fish Stark blends history, humor, and cognitive psychology in a look back at the legacy of American heroes. From John Dewey and Frederick Douglass to Jamie Raskin and Quinta Brunson, these people have changed our country for the better. Fairer, more equal, more open, more innovative, not by mere coincidence, but because of their humanist beliefs. Fish will offer a framework for helping humanists renew our sense of connection to national identity at a moment where our national leaders embrace anti-humanist principles. Let's see, I think that's it. So join us in the outer room for your sample of this delicious beverage. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, you did a great job telling making the bigger story about its history and the legacy. Like I said, the character.